Amid a monstrous blizzard blanketing the Sawtooth Range, Boone Keller, a reclusive man on his way back to his cabin, stumbled upon a dark figure collapsed in the snow. It was a wild Mustang, bleeding and barely breathing. Yet its eyes were pleading. Boone nearly turned away. But one last glance, and everything he believed about life, regret, and redemption was changed forever. The January wind tore through the cliffs of the Sawtooth Range like a ravenous beast howling for its next meal. The snowstorm had struck the Idaho mountains without warning, unleashing a cold so fierce that even breath seemed to freeze midair. Beneath that whitewashed horizon, a lone figure on horseback trudged along Timberline Trail, once dubbed Heaven's Gate of the West by summer hikers. But now, it was nothing more than a frozen death path wrapped in silence and ice. Boone Keller pulled his coat collar high, gloved hands gripping the reins tight. His eyes, shaded beneath the brim of a weathered cap, scanned the sparse forest with quiet vigilance. Beneath layers of thick wool and a time-worn leather jacket, his body was lean and tough as pine. But in those eyes that had seen more than once the moment life left another soul, there was only a mute stillness now. Boone wasn't a ranger anymore, no longer the local hero featured in small-town papers for saving trapped wildlife. He'd lived alone in these mountains for 4 years now, ever since that cursed night when a child's life slipped through his hands. Sophia, 9 years old, red-haired, lost from a summer camp hike. Boone had been on duty that day. The entire state of Idaho was shaken by the story. Boone? He buried himself atop Timberline. Now, he made ends meet as a seasonal forest watchman, and by helping locals with legal trapping routes. No cell phone, no Wi-Fi, no visitors. Except Ellie, his younger sister, who still sent him dry goods monthly and sometimes reached out via shortwave radio. Ellie still believed he hadn't lost himself completely. But Boone didn't. He lived on because he lacked the nerve to die. A strong gust startled the old horse beneath him, making it toss its head. Boone whispered, "Easy there," and gave the animal a reassuring pat on the neck. Wind sliced down from the peaks like razors, stinging his face. He turned the reins gently, nudging the horse back toward his cabin, about 2 miles out. All he needed was to reach it before nightfall. Then he stopped. Amid the blinding white, a dark shape lay motionless. At first, Boone thought it was a fallen tree, or worse, a bear carcass. But as he dismounted and walked toward it, boots crunching the snow, wind howling through the trees, he realized what it was. A horse. A wild Mustang. Its coat was gray-brown, matted with ice. Snow covered half its body. Along its left flank, a gaping wound stretched deep and purple, cutting all the way down to the belly. Could have been a sharp rock. Could have been claws. The blood had frozen, but the eyes, those eyes were still open. Boone knelt beside it. The horse was breathing, barely. Each rise and fall of its chest was labored, sometimes spasming. When their eyes met, the animal gave a faint, rasping sound. The kind a creature makes when it's too weak to call for help but refuses to die alone. Boone swallowed hard. His throat felt dry as stone. He meant to stand and walk away. This wasn't his problem. But something in that gaze, the raw, quiet desperation, the quiet dignity, rooted him in place. "Damn it," he muttered, slinging off his pack. He moved fast, emergency rope, waterproof tarp, folding knife. Numb fingers looped the cord across the horse's chest, then tucked a thin wool blanket beneath it, his own. Boone spoke softly, more to himself than to the animal. "Don't die before we make it back, buddy." Dragging a wounded horse through a snowstorm over a mile of rough trail, that's not something you do out of kindness. It's something you do when you know you can't walk away again. Gritting his teeth, Boone tightened the rope and began to pull. The snow came up to his ankles. The wind slapped his face like open palms. His breath poured out in clouds. Sweat stung his back under the chill. The horse was heavy, but it didn't resist. It allowed itself to be moved. Sometimes it tried to lift a leg, tried to shift. It wanted to live. Each step was a battle. At times, Boone nearly collapsed. But those eyes, the Mustang's eyes looking at him like he was the last warmth left in a frozen world, kept him going. After nearly 2 hours with the sky choking the distant trees in thick mist, Boone reached the door of his old cabin. He shoved it open with his shoulder and pulled the horse dusty inside. The name had come to him without thinking. The scent of old smoke, wet straw, and dried blood filled the air. Boone dropped to the floor, panting. The horse slumped beside him, breathing heavily. but breathing. Still breathing. Boone couldn't see his face in the cracked mirror above the stove, but he knew something inside had just shifted. Outside, the storm still raged like a beast, but inside there was only Boone and Dusty, and the quiet promise of something unspoken. Inside the cabin, flames flickered weakly in the old wood stove, casting a rare warmth that seemed to defy the raging winter just outside. Boone knelt by the freshly lit fire, his hands still trembling from the effort of hauling Dusty through the storm. Snow clung to his collar, boots soaked through, but he didn't care. His eyes stayed fixed on the form lying motionless on the wooden floor, the wild Mustang, its body caked in dried blood and frozen slush. Boone scattered a pile of old straw beneath Dusty's belly, fetched from the corner of the storage shed. He covered the horse with a wool army blanket, then peeled off his leather gloves and pressed a bare hand gently to its neck. Still warm. Not much, but warm. The heavy breaths came in ragged beats like the last flickers of a candle. He eased back, slumping against the wall, sore muscles pressing into the cold timber. The room was so quiet, Boone could hear his own heartbeat, loud, uneven, like it was trying to tell him something he wasn't ready to face. Outside, the storm roared on like a ravenous monster, but inside, it was just him and the horse, a stranger, a creature with no name, no owner, and no real chance at survival, if not for a moment of impulse or something deeper. Boone hadn't named an animal since the accident, but somehow as soon as he'd pulled the horse into the cabin, the name Dusty had escaped his lips. Maybe because of its grimy gray coat. Maybe because it reminded him of the horses on his family ranch, creatures he once thought of as friends. Dusty groaned softly, legs twitching, then fell still again. The wound along its side still oozed blood. Boone stood, walked to a battered old cabinet, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and a small cloth sack of sea salt wrapped in canvas. He poured a capful of the liquor and drizzled it across the gash. Dusty flinched, eyes going wide, but didn't kick. Maybe it was too weak. Maybe it trusted him. "Sorry," Boone muttered, his voice tight as he disinfected the torn flesh. He bandaged the wound with a clean cloth, then sank to the floor, fingers laced tightly together. He stared at the firelight, the flickers dancing in his eyes that once didn't blink at death, but now blurred in the smoke. That day, "I was too late," he whispered, maybe to the fire, maybe to Dusty, maybe just to himself. "I didn't save her. I wasn't fast enough, good enough. Or maybe I was just too scared." The wind shrieked through a crack in the window frame, echoing like a cry from the mountain's heart. Boone clenched his jaw, eyes shifting toward Dusty, frail, bleeding, half-frozen, but with eyes that remained wide open, unblinking, brave. "You're not asking for forgiveness," Boone said quietly, placing a hand on the horse's forehead. "You're not blaming anyone. You just want to live. And this time, I'm not walking away." In that moment, inside a crumbling cabin, in the middle of a deadly storm, there were no heroics, no miracles, just two battered souls clinging to each other like matches fighting for one last flame. Boone got up, moving around the cabin to check supplies. The stove was holding steady, but the firewood wouldn't last beyond the night. He couldn't sleep. He had to stay alert. He returned to Dusty's side, pulled out the whiskey bottle, took a small sip and looked toward the horse. "Remember what it felt like to trust someone?" Boone asked, not expecting an answer. "I almost forgot, but you're making me remember." He leaned against the wall, draped an extra blanket over his knees, and never took his eyes off Dusty. The fire flickered in rhythm with the horse's breath. Boone's eyes drifted shut. The room was still cold, but inside him something had begun to thaw, faint and fragile, like holding the hand of something dying, and realizing you're the one being saved. Near midnight, Boone jerked awake. The wind outside was louder, angrier. A soft noise to his right brought him back to reality. Dusty stirred. Its front legs scraped weakly against the floor, as if trying to stand. Boone scrambled over, cradling its neck. "Easy, Dusty. Don't push it. You're not ready." But Dusty didn't stop. It let out a soft groan, eyes locked on Boone, as if trying to say something. A plea, a message, or simply a desire to stay. Boone held its neck tighter, voice cracking. "You're not alone. Not this time." Outside, the storm still screamed like a saw blade across the mountain. But in that old wooden cabin, two beings, a broken man and a wounded horse, held on together. And in that silence, Boone Keller knew one thing. He was starting to come back, not to the world outside, but to the world within himself. The next morning brought no mercy. The sky remained clenched in a storm's grip. Wind howled with renewed fury, blasting walls of snow into the mountain's face like it meant to strip the Sawtooth Range of all life. The cabin's windows rattled under the force. Cold wind screamed through the cracks in the timber. Rafters groaned overhead, long, uneasy moans, like even the house itself was fighting to stay upright. Boone Keller hadn't slept. He couldn't remember how many times he'd nodded off only to jolt awake again, but each time his eyes opened, the first thing he looked for was Dusty. Still there, still breathing, still alive. But this morning, as Boone rose to his feet, a soft cracking sound echoed above him. Roof timber. Then another, louder, more distinct, a warning. He looked up. A long split had appeared along the beam, jagged as if struck by an axe. Boone narrowed his eyes and stepped outside. Snow had piled halfway up the cabin's walls. He inhaled sharply. The air burned like ice. But more terrifying than the cold was the sound underneath it all, the deep breath of the mountain, the snapping of snow layers, the wind howling low through narrow canyons, the kind of silence so deep it let you hear your own heartbeat in your ears. He returned inside and looked quietly at the horse trembling on the straw. Dusty was past the danger zone, but it would only take one falling beam to end it all. Boone crossed the cabin, knelt before an old wooden trunk. From inside, he pulled out 2 long pine planks, a heavy coil of rope, a flashlight, a bag of emergency food rations, and an extra pair of gloves. At the very bottom, an old worn map, folded in quarters, stained with coffee and time. He laid it out across the floor. North was Timberline Trail. About 1.5 miles away, marked with a faint triangle, was a low rock cave Boone had used years ago to shelter hunting dogs. It was tucked beneath a ledge, the only place safe from avalanche and wind if this cabin came down. He looked at Dusty. The horse was still breathing, but its chest rose and fell faster than before. It was feverish. Its hind legs twitched. Blood oozed slowly again from the wound, soaking the straw beneath. Boone moved toward it, knelt, and gently stroked its icy brow. "We're out of time." Without waiting further, he looped the rope around Dusty's chest and hips, threading it through the pine planks to form a makeshift sled. He tied each knot tight, then double-checked. Then again, he stood and gave a test pull. It felt heavier than the day before, much heavier. Not just because of deeper snow. Dusty was slipping fast. Boone walked to the rack above the stove and grabbed a long ash walking stick, once his forest companion. He strapped on the backpack, tucked the flashlight into his coat, then turned for one last look at the horse. "Okay," he whispered, tightening the rope. "You can't walk, I'll drag. But you better fight, you hear me?" Wind slammed into the door as he opened it. One step, then another. The cabin faded behind them, swallowed by the blinding white. Snow layered Boone's shoulders, crept down his neck. He hunched forward and pulled with all his strength. Each foot sank into knee-deep snow. But he didn't stop. Dusty slid slowly behind, guided by the planks. When ice made it tilt, Boone adjusted course. There was no music for this battle. Only wind, only breath, only the sound of his heart pounding in his ears like war drums. Halfway to the cave, Boone froze. Up ahead, a figure. He squinted through the flurries. Something was moving. Not an animal, not a tree. A man, young, staggering through the storm. His coat was sun-bleached, scarf pulled tight, feet dragging like they could collapse any second. Boone dropped the rope and rushed forward. "Hey!" he shouted, but the wind stole the sound away. He switched on his flashlight, raised it high, and yelled again. "Over here!" The stranger stopped, turned, then stumbled toward him. As he neared, Boone saw the pale face, lips tinged blue, eyes wide with panic. "Help me!" the man gasped. "I'm lost. I was looking for my brother." Boone grabbed him, lowering him gently to the snow, pulling a blanket from his pack and wrapping it around him. "Easy. What's your name?" "Cal," the man whispered. "Cal Monroe? I was trying to find my brother." "Garrett." Boone went still. Garrett Monroe. He knew that name. Ellie had mentioned it. A scout lost in the Eastern Range. The search had been called off after 3 weeks. Cal trembled, eyes unfocused. Boone glanced back toward Dusty, just 20 steps behind. The horse was watching, like it understood what was happening. Boone stood, looked at both. A man, a horse, both on the edge, and only him in between. He bent down, looked Cal in the eyes, then glanced back at Dusty. The wind tore at his face. Then Dusty let out a low, piercing cry. Boone spun. The horse had lifted its head, looking straight at Cal. And in that silent agreement, Boone exhaled, nodded. "All right," he said, voice hoarse. "We leave no one behind." He pulled Cal to his feet, slung one arm around his shoulders. One hand gripped Cal, the other grasped the rope tethering Dusty. This time, every step was a war against their limits. No longer just a man and a horse. Now 3 lives and a storm. None of them spoke. There was only the wind, the snow, and their footsteps marching silently toward the cliffs, where a small cave, a little warmth, and maybe hope waited. The rock cave lay hidden beneath a sweeping stone arch, one of those places only someone who'd lived long enough in the Sawtooths, like Boone Keller, would know existed. It wasn't deep, it wasn't wide, but the overhang was just enough to break the wind. In springtime, wolf pups sometimes sheltered there before they followed their mothers into the wild. Now, it was all they had. Boone had nearly dragged both Cal and Dusty the final stretch. Cal was barely conscious, slumped in Boone's arms, breathing in short, shivering gasps. Dusty slid over the makeshift wooden skids, at times seeming not to move at all, until Boone would call, "Dusty," and the horse would groan, faint but present, answering. The rope between them wasn't just knots, it was something deeper, a promise not to let go. Wind screamed through the canyon. Snow reached Boone's knees. When he finally spotted the cave's narrow mouth, blurred by the whiteout haze, he could barely believe it. But he didn't stop. Not now. He pulled Dusty in first, laying the horse gently against the rear wall of the cave. Then he turned back, lifting Cal from the snow. The young man was limp, his legs useless. Boone laid him down beside Dusty, in the driest spot he could find. He then reached into his coat for a bundle of dry pine kindling and a waterproof matchbox. Within moments, a flame sprang up, small, flickering, but enough to throw light across 3 battered faces. The cave warmed slightly. Boone knelt beside Dusty, checking the wound. The bleeding had slowed, no longer seeping in streams. He removed the old bandage, sprinkled the last of his sea salt over the gash, and wrapped it again with fresh cloth. Dusty didn't cry out, just trembled. Every breath still shallow but steady. Boone nodded. "A little hope?" He turned to Cal. The boy's breathing was raspy but stronger than the night before. Boone stripped off his outer coat and laid it over Cal's shoulders, then rummaged through his bag and found his last protein bar. He broke it in half, pressing a piece gently to Cal's lips. Cal stirred, opened his eyes. They were fogged but alive. "Am I dreaming?" Cal murmured. "No, you're alive," Boone said, voice rough. "Garrett? Where's Garrett?" Cal's eyes darted, searching the air for someone not there. Boone didn't answer. He knew who Garrett was. The scout who'd gone missing a month ago, red backpack, walked into the forest and never came out. The search parties gave up after 10 days. Boone looked him in the eye and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Garrett hasn't been found, but if you're still breathing, there's still a chance." Cal closed his eyes. A tear slipped down his cheek. Boone pulled the army blanket from his bag and tucked it around both Cal and Dusty. Then he leaned against the stone wall, pulling his knees close, chin resting on folded arms. Outside, the wind still howled. Inside, the fire crackled gently, like a heart trying to beat one more time. Time slowed in that cave, as if the world outside had frozen in place. Boone didn't sleep. Every few minutes, he looked to Cal, chest rising slowly, then to Dusty, breath weak but still there. And in that silence, Boone started thinking about that day, the day he walked away from the world. Sophia, 9 years old, chestnut eyes and a dimpled smile, lost in the woods during a school field trip. Boone had been the only ranger on duty. He'd been careless. Thought the Sawtooth Range didn't kill. Not a child. Not then. He was wrong. They found her 4 days later, frozen stiff, lying beneath a rock ledge. Arms still wrapped around a torn glove. Boone had been the one to carry her body out of the forest. Since then, he couldn't touch people. Couldn't let anyone say his name like they knew him. Couldn't forgive himself. Until yesterday, when the eyes of a wild horse had stopped him cold. Boone looked up. His gaze met Dusty's, still open, still holding a flicker of fire. He crawled closer, placed his hand gently on its forehead. "You're teaching me how to come back," he whispered. Dusty nudged its head softly into Boone's palm. There was no miracle in this story, only one truth. Someone chose not to walk away, and sometimes that's enough. The next morning, the snow had thinned, the wind softened. Pale sunlight filtered through the mouth of the cave, waking Boone gently. Cal was still lying there, but breathing steadily. Dusty slept too, its chest rising and falling slowly, normally. Boone rose and stepped outside. The eastern sky glowed with faint purple. Light shimmered across the endless snow like a promise. He inhaled deeply, for the first time in years, without bitterness. But then, he looked toward the distant ridge. He knew the cabin wouldn't hold, and in this cold, unless someone found them soon, they wouldn't last much longer. He clenched his fists. The next journey wouldn't just be about survival. It would be about bringing these lives to safety, whatever it took. The wind had changed again. Boone Keller felt it in the way the pine branches shivered outside the cave's mouth. The snow wasn't as heavy as yesterday, but the air was wetter, colder, and the gusts now carried something new. Not just ice, but low, guttural roars rolling in from the eastern range. The wind sounded like a stranger knocking at your door after midnight, cold, mysterious, carrying no promise but danger. Inside the cave, the fire had gone out. Ash still glowed, but the dry wood was gone. Boone crouched and rummaged through his pack, only a small bundle of brittle sticks he'd picked up the day before, and 2 remaining matches. Cal Monroe was still asleep, lips dry and peeling, but his pulse stronger than the night before. The boy lay curled beneath Boone's old army jacket, head resting on an empty pack. Dusty lay in the darkest corner of the cave, legs folded beneath him, his back drenched with sweat and melting snow. Occasionally, he twitched, as if still fighting through a dream too heavy to understand. Boone stood, stepped over to Dusty, and laid a hand on his neck. The skin was cold, but breath still came. Shallow, but there. He exhaled, a silver cloud blooming in the frigid air. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. If he didn't find help, or real shelter, then even if they made it through tonight, they'd have nothing left tomorrow. The dried meat was gone. The fire was gone. And the thin string connecting these 3 lives was fraying by the minute. Boone stepped outside. The world was still white, but far off through the haze he saw the jagged line of Ridgeback Peak, a path marked on the old map that could lead down to an abandoned ranger trail toward the Bridger Valley. He estimated the distance. If he left now, he might reach the emergency signal point within 3 hours, if he didn't get lost. But there was no way he could carry Cal. And pulling Dusty across that wind-scoured basin? Impossible. He turned back, his eyes falling on both of them, Cal and Dusty. Boone tightened his grip on his backpack, then walked over and knelt beside Cal. "Cal," he said, shaking his shoulder gently. "Wake up, kid." Cal stirred. Heavy eyelids lifted. His voice was raw. "I'm still alive?" "Not sure yet," Boone said with a thin smile, though his eyes stayed serious. "But we've got to make sure." Cal pushed himself up, trembling. Boone sat back, knees drawn, hands clasped, voice calm but firm. "I have to leave. We're out of food. I think Ridgeback has a signal line. If I move fast, I can get there before sundown." He paused. Cal looked up at him. "But I can't take you and Dusty both," Boone said. "I travel faster alone. If I'm lucky, I'll be back before nightfall." Cal stared at him, eyes wide. He tried to speak, then swallowed hard. Boone continued. "I'm leaving the flashlight. There's a small knife and a first aid kit. In my pack, there's a blanket liner and some dry cloth. Keep the fire going. I left a few coals." Cal's breath hitched, his voice cracked. "What if you don't come back?" Boone didn't answer at first. He just clenched his backpack straps and stood. The wind howled like a reminder there was no time left. He stepped over to Dusty, knelt low and whispered, "Watch over the kid, will you? You made it. Now it's your turn to guard someone else." Dusty blinked. Boone didn't know if the horse understood, but that look, the same one that stopped him in his tracks the first night, was enough of a reply. Boone began the climb. The trail up to Ridgeback wasn't meant for hesitation. The rocks were slick. The snow hid the ledges. The wind lashed his face like knives. At times, he had to crawl on all fours, gripping exposed roots to keep from being blown off the slope. Every breath burned like fire in his chest. But he didn't stop. In his mind, he saw Cal, blue lips, shivering body. He saw Dusty, those eyes dimmer than before. He saw Ellie, his sister, the only one still calling him on a frequency he never answered. And Sophia, those hazel eyes forever closed. When Boone finally reached the crest, he nearly collapsed. But he dug into his pack, pulled out the emergency flare kit, His hands were shaking. The wind almost stole the lighter from his fingers. He clenched his jaw, shielded the spark with his backpack. "Don't fail me now, you piece of junk." The flame caught. The flare ignited, blazing red, painting the sky with fire. Boone held it high, eyes shut tight, whispering a silent prayer. Not for himself. For Cal. For Dusty. When the flare died, he dropped to his knees. The wind howled, but Boone smiled for the first time in 4 years, because this time he hadn't run. When Boone returned to the cave, the snow had thickened again, but inside, the fire still burned. Cal sat propped against Dusty, his face smudged with ash, but his eyes bright. Boone saw those eyes, saw Dusty, still breathing, and something clenched tight in his chest. "You really came back," Cal said, lips cracked but smiling wide. Boone nodded, collapsing beside them. "I didn't promise I would," he said, "but I made a promise to myself." Dusty nudged his shoulder gently, a silent thank you. Boone didn't cry. He just pressed his hand to that tired neck, resting his forehead against the warmth. They didn't die. They had each other. And this time, faith wasn't paid in blood, but in the refusal to let go. Boone Keller had never imagined that something as small as a light could make a grown man cry. But that morning, as they emerged from the cave and trudged through waist-deep snow toward a sliver of hope, he saw it, a faint, flickering light through the falling gray, the glow of a wooden window tucked behind the blur of pine and storm. It brought Boone to a full stop, like a dream brushing against his chest. "Cal, look," he said, pointing, his voice trembling, not from the cold, but something deeper. Cal, more alert now but still weak, leaned on his walking stick. His eyes widened. "Is that a real light?" Boone nodded. "Someone's there, and there's fire." Dusty followed behind them, ribs visible beneath his thin hide, body trembling with each step, but still walking, still trying. His back was blanketed in snow, his coat tangled with sweat and dried blood. But his eyes, those eyes still held fire. Boone had only ever seen that look in one other place, in his own reflection, years ago, when he still believed things could be made right. The cabin emerged slowly from the trees, a small home tucked beneath ancient pines, just big enough for one life and a handful of memories. Boone recognized it. Martha Beckett's cabin. She had been a retired nurse, living off-grid on this mountain since her husband passed. 12 years, no word. But clearly, she was still here, still lighting her lamp. Boone knocked, 3 sharp raps. Silence. He knocked again, louder. The door creaked open. A woman in her 60s appeared, weathered face framed in silver hair, eyes sharp as flint. But when she saw Boone, Cal, and the broken horse behind them, her expression changed. She opened the door wide. "Oh, dear God," Martha breathed. "Get in, now." Boone helped Cal through first. The cabin's warmth hit him like a first embrace after a nightmare, smelling of herbs, wood smoke, old fabric, and memory. Boone dropped to his knees, breathing hard. Martha caught Cal and guided him to a thickly blanketed bench. She checked his pulse, felt his forehead, poured him warm water without needing to ask. "He's hypothermic, dehydrated, exhausted. But he'll be all right," she said with clinical confidence. Boone nodded, but his eyes were on the door, where Dusty still stood, unmoving. He didn't cross the threshold, as if he knew this place wasn't meant for him. Martha followed Boone's gaze. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, gently, "There's an old stall behind the house. I'll lay out fresh straw and blankets, bring him around." Boone stepped out, stroked Dusty's neck. "Almost there, old boy." The stall was small, nestled behind the cabin, weathered but dry. Boone laid fresh straw, spread warm blankets, and checked Dusty's hooves and wound under the soft glow of an oil lantern. The horse collapsed gently into the straw. He groaned as Boone massaged warming oil into his shoulders. Behind him, Martha approached, carrying a bowl of warm water and clean bandages. "I didn't think anyone remembered this trail anymore," she said softly. "Not in a storm like that." Boone didn't look up. "I didn't think I'd be back here either, but I didn't have a choice." Martha sat on the threshold, hands resting on her knees. She studied Boone like someone trying to find a long-lost truth. "You're Boone Keller. I remember you." Boone froze. Just a moment, then continued wrapping Dusty's leg. "If this is about Sophia—" "No," she interrupted. "I remember you as the man who never quit. And now I see you dragging a near-dead boy and a dying horse through a snowstorm, and I know you're still that man." Boone gave a dry laugh. "I'm just doing what I should have done a long time ago." "That's how it starts, Boone. Not by forgetting, but by choosing right, even when it's too late. Boone stayed quiet. His hand rested on Dusty's warming shoulder. It was no longer cold. That night, Cal lay bundled in thick blankets, sipping hot broth beside the wood stove. Boone sat by the window, looking out at the stall, where Dusty now lay resting, his breath calm, his side rising and falling with new rhythm. Martha handed Boone a mug of tea, then sat across from him. "You didn't think you'd survive, did you?" Boone shook his head. "I thought, if I died trying to save them, at least it'd be better than dying for nothing." "But you didn't die." He sipped the tea, inhaled the herbs. "Do you think I deserve to live?" he asked quietly. Martha's eyes were soft, steady. "You saved what no one else would. You're still a good man, and good men can rebuild their lives." Boone didn't answer. He just nodded. And something inside him, something frozen for 4 long years, began to melt. Not the pain, not the guilt, but the shell. And from beneath it, something warm began to move, quietly, like a flame rekindled after the storm, like a trail uncovered under melting snow. Tomorrow, there'd be more to do. But tonight, they were alive. And sometimes, that's enough to begin again. Spring came late to the Sawtooth Mountains, but when it arrived, it felt like a quiet apology from the earth. Snow melting slowly from pine branches to reveal velvet moss, and narrow trickles of water whispering through stone crevices like the forest exhaling after a long, frozen sleep. Boone Keller sat on the steps of his rebuilt cabin, the one he had raised with his own hands after that deadly winter. The scent of fresh-cut pine still clung to his sleeves. The house wasn't large, but it stood solid now. He'd fixed the roof, added a back room, and planted wild herbs near the stove. Each morning, Boone split wood, boiled water, and made tea from the herbs Martha had left behind, something that helped him sleep deeper and think clearer. Down in the valley, wild apple trees had begun to bud, and far off, hoofbeats echoed softly across the recovering grasslands. Dusty. The Mustang had not only survived the storm, he had healed. Stronger now than he was in the wild, with a thick silver-gray coat like mountain mist, and eyes that sparkled as if they understood everything that had happened. Every time Boone stepped outside, Dusty would stroll over, nudge his shoulder in greeting. "Good morning, old friend," Boone whispered, hand resting on Dusty's neck. He no longer called Dusty a wild horse. Because Dusty was no longer a stray, he was family. Cal Monroe left the cabin 3 weeks after the storm. He had regained his strength, steadied his nerves. The 21-year-old was no longer the frost-bitten boy Boone had pulled from the snow. His skin no longer looked pale, and his gaze no longer flinched. Cal had learned how to stoke a fire, how to stretch a horse's legs, how to read trails and tracks. Boone taught him all the things he had once vowed never to share again. One afternoon, when Dusty was well enough to walk the South Ridge, Cal rode him alongside Boone down to the old ranger station, abandoned for years. There, they met the new search team dispatched from the county office. Cal asked about his brother, Garrett Monroe, the man who had gone missing before the storm. No one had new leads. Until one evening, a blinking signal light caught Boone's eye from the foot of the ridge. He raised his binoculars and saw a red flag tied to a tall pine, a sign only trained scouts would recognize. Boone and Cal climbed 2 hours to that very spot. Garrett Monroe, thinner, bearded but alive, had been camping inside a rock crevice, surviving for 40 days on dry rations and pure grit. The reunion between the brothers made Boone turn away. Cal gripped Garrett like he'd never let go, tears streaming down his face. "I thought I lost you." Garrett nodded, eyes wet. "I thought no one was looking anymore, but then I saw the flare and I knew you hadn't given up." Behind them, Dusty nudged Boone's hand. He smiled softly. For the first time since Sophia, Boone didn't feel stuck in the past anymore. Boone didn't leave the mountains. He turned down the offer to return to ranger duty. Not out of fear, but because he understood. His work no longer fit within paperwork or a badge. He rebuilt the old cabin, now a waypoint for those caught in snowstorms, for lost travelers, or for souls who didn't know what they were looking for, until someone stopped and asked, "Are you okay?" Boone named it the Dusty Stop. Cal returned sometimes, always bringing someone with him, a young mother lost off-trail, an old man revisiting childhood camps. Garrett mailed thank-you letters, sometimes with pictures of their new family. In one photo, Boone, Dusty, and Cal stood together in front of the cabin. Martha Beckett, the nurse who had saved them, passed away the following fall, peacefully in her sleep. Boone came to say goodbye. On her nightstand was a small journal. Names scrawled inside, those she had helped, those no one else remembered. Boone's name was the last entry. Boone Keller returned with a horse, a boy, and a piece of his heart. He closed the book and placed his hand over his chest, quietly. One morning, light snow fell like powdered sugar. Boone was gathering kindling when Dusty came galloping from the ridge, his coat dusted with flakes, eyes shining mischief. He stopped in front of Boone and nudged him hard in the shoulder. Boone rested his hand on Dusty's brow and whispered, "I saved you, but you saved me too." Dusty snorted gently, as if in agreement. Boone looked toward the distant peaks, the range stretching endlessly into the horizon. He didn't know what the future held, how many more might lose their way in the blizzard of life. But he knew this: whenever someone needed to be pulled from the cold, needed a fire, or just a look that held no judgment, this place, with Dusty and a man who once was lost, would always be waiting. If you believe that sometimes it's the wild ones who teach us how to trust, leave a 1 below. If you've ever witnessed or felt a silent moment of connection between a human and an animal, drop a 0. And if the story of Boone, Dusty, and Cal made your heart slow down for just 1 beat, don't forget to hit subscribe, so you don't miss the next journey that speaks to the deepest corners of the soul, where freedom, love, and life are always told through the eyes of those we almost lost.